Alright guys, this is the last portion of the book. So here we go. Eventually they sat down, stewing in awkward silence. The fire had consumed most of the barn's far wall, the one that had been lined with hay bales. The building's scorched framework rose in blackened shadow against the light, resembling used-up matchsticks. Finally, Gabe worked up the nerve to tell Seth what had happened in there, or what he remembered at least. Seth listened, and when Gabe finished, he released a slow, trembling sigh. "I don't think we're done yet," he sighed. Gabe nodded. "It's Halloween. The night when the dead come back, when the curtain that separates the worlds of the living and the dead is the weakest. And if that's true, tonight must be the night when Mason is the strongest. He still has a few hours left to hunt." "I really just want to go home," said Gabe. Every muscle ached. His throat felt like it had been scraped out with an electric mixer. His skin felt crispy. "But what if he won't stop?" Seth asked. "What if, when we try to get to sleep later tonight, he does something else? Something worse?" "Worse than burning me and my baby sister alive?" "Yes," Seth answered. His certainty was chilling. Gabe covered his face, but Seth rested his hand on his shoulder. "We've got to find Mason's bones," he insisted. "Destroy them, or bury them, and we have to do it tonight." Gabe glanced up. The lights from the truck splashed sporadic color out into the forest. Firefighters continued to blast water at the barn, soaking the remaining wood in the surrounding grass to keep the dwindling flames from spreading. Glenn and Dolores were still huddled at the back of the ambulance, flanked by Elise, leaning over Miri. No one seemed to notice that he and Seth were sitting on the porch steps. If they were going to disappear, they needed to do it now. "Where do we start?" Gabe asked, standing clutching his side. Mason's body could be anywhere. Seth climbed to his feet, too. "That map you made of Slade, the red spiral ended in one particular spot." He nodded at the darkness behind the house, toward the slope that led to Temple House at the top of the hill. "The woods," Gabe said, "but that still leaves us with a few dozen acres to search." Seth rose onto his toes, peering toward the barn. "What is it?" Gabe asked. "You see something?" "I have an idea." Seth stepped forward into the driveway. He waved for Gabe to follow him. Gabe's body ached in places he hadn't realized he'd been hurt. His lungs felt as though they'd shrunk by 50%. As he rushed to keep up, Gabe glanced back toward the ambulance. His family would never understand what he'd told Seth. Even Elise seemed too frightened now to fight. Shadows pulsed across the lawn, similar to the shifting shape that had been chasing him all night. He quickly decided that it would be a bigger mistake to stick around here. "What are we looking for?" Gabe asked, struggling to catch his breath. "You said you saw a boy in the barn." "Yeah, but I also smacked my head pretty hard when I jumped down from the hayloft." "What if there was someone else with you?" Seth asked. They wandered around the corner of the barn, cut off from view in the fire trucks. As they approached the broken door where Gabe had escaped the fire, he slowed his pace. "Someone besides you and Miri and Mason." "He was approaching you, but then the hunter emerged from the smoke and attacked him?" "I think so, but—" Seth stopped talking and held up his hands. "After everything you've seen tonight," he said, "after everything that's happened, you still don't believe?" Gabe blinked. On any other evening, this would have been a laughably dramatic gesture. Here, now, mere steps away from the burning barn, Seth appeared almost regal, a robber prince. A hot wind rushed from the building. Gabe felt suddenly faint. He shook his head. "Of course I believe," he whispered. "I don't think that other boy was trying to hurt you," Seth went on. "He gave you the tool to get out of here, the stone you used to smash the door. He saved your life." Splinters of wood were scattered across the dirt. The stone lay among them. It was pale and flat. Something about it was strangely familiar. Gabe crossed his arms, nervous to step closer. "This is it," said Seth. The breeze blew his hair back from his forehead. He crouched down, rubbed his fingers over its surface. "Am I right?" He glanced up at Gabe. Gabe bit his lip and nodded. "What if the boy wasn't only trying to save your life?" Seth smiled wanly. "What if at the same time he was trying to give you a clue?" "A clue to what? Where have we seen stones like this before?" Despite the heat, Gabe felt a chill. He understood. Seth glanced toward the dark woods in the distance to the place they'd once called Howler's Notch. Inside the notch, an altar stood. Someone had piled up stones like the one in the dirt beside the barn, an altar that Raven had believed contained the hunter's power. Beneath the stones there'd been a hollow spot. When Meat Pie nearly uncovered it over a month ago, a voice had told him to stop before he'd been able to dig. Had called out "don't" with a voice similar to the one that had spoken to Gabe in the barn earlier that night. The boys stood together by the pile of stones. Without a word, Seth grabbed a flat, round rock from the top of the so-called altar and tossed it to the ground. It slid to a halt a few feet down the slope. Gabe tried to do the same, but his hands were shaking so much he managed only to loosen the structure. Stones rolled noisily to the base of the cairn. Gabe looked up, wide-eyed, but Seth shrugged. "Might as well get on with it," he whispered, pushing at the stack as Gabe had accidentally done. "The catalyst for another miniature avalanche. Faster, this way," Seth added. It took about 10 minutes to spread the pile out into the hillock. When the boys had nearly uncovered the altar's base, Gabe slowed, remembering the last time he'd been here. He had a better idea now of what was below. Together the boys knelt down and cleared away the last few stones. Underneath, they discovered a couple rotting planks of wood. The boys glanced at each other in surprise. Seth reached out for one plank, Gabe for the other. At Gabe's touch, numerous insects scattered across the board. Some raced onto his hand. Pressing his lips together to contain his disgust, he threw the piece of wood as hard as he could. It rustled through low leaves in the distance. Gabe shook himself off, brushed at his jacket, imagining hundreds of tiny claws clutching at the inside of his clothes. Seth was doing the same. Gabe almost laughed at how ridiculous they both looked, but he managed to hold that inside too. In the dim starlight, the boys saw what lay beneath the boards. The roots of the crooked tree had formed a type of netting, which had held up the planks and the stones. Below these roots was a deep indentation, beyond which lay pitch blackness. A musty smell rose up from the hole. It was raw earth, decay, moisture, and rot. Gabe felt himself start to gag, but then he began to breathe through his mouth instead of his nose, which helped. "What is this place?" Seth asked. "The grave," said Gabe. "The grave?" said Gabe, "but it goes deep." He picked up a pebble from the rubble of the altar. "Listen." Seth dropped it into the depression. The pebble tumbled between the roots, then disappeared into the darkness. Seconds later, a pip echoed up at them. The stone had found the bottom. "I think this hole might be a well." "A well?" Gabe leaned back. "Like for water?" "It's possible, though it's probably dried up now," said Seth. "My dad told me that 100 years ago, before the trees took over, this was all farmland. That's what all those stone walls are for. They divided up the properties." "Isn't that dangerous?" Gabe asked. An echo rose up from the chasm, and he suddenly felt like a fool. "Dangerous," said his voice. "Dangerous? Dangerous? Leaving a well like this out in the middle of nowhere?" "My thought exactly." Seth stared into the emptiness. "If this hole is what we are looking for, then you know who is all the way at the bottom." "You think he fell in, the night with the rooster?" "If so, we need to figure out a way to get him out." "No way," said Gabe, shaking his head. "This isn't just a grave." A knot formed in his chest. "We've got to get help." Seth stood up. "You're right," he said slowly, his voice teasing. "Why don't you go ask the fire brigade to stop what they're doing and come out here for a recovery of a 50-year-old skeleton at the bottom of an abandoned pit?" "We're completely unprepared. I wouldn't know how to do this even in broad daylight." "I say we start by clearing away these roots." "Why didn't we bring shovels?" "They were in the barn," said Seth. He sighed and added more nervously, "Mason almost killed you tonight, and Miri too. If we leave here right now, he's free to try again. We don't have time to argue or to find help, and if we go back for shovels, anyone might stop us and keep us from coming back here. Don't you get it?" "I'm sorry," said Gabe. I'm just scared." "I am too. I really am. But tonight, I think we've both proven that we're more than just scared. Tonight we've learned how to be brave." Here was Raven again, spine straight, chin tilted toward the sky. His words were cheesy, but the sentiment was comforting. And not just brave in a game, brave where it really counts. In here. Gabe wasn't sure where in here was exactly, but he understood that the robber prince's bravery now belonged to Seth. And if that gave him strength to survive, then who cared how crazy how it sounded? "Heck, I'll be meat pie now if it gets me home," Gabe thought. He shook his head in disbelief, knelt forward, and peered into the crevasse. Though the tangled system was fairly solid, the boys were able to pluck away some of the roots from the side of the hole, revealing enough space for a body to fit through. Even better, a few of the thickest roots looked like they might go deep enough to act as a ladder of sorts. "So?" Seth perched on the opposite side of the opening. He glanced down. "Who's the lucky one, you or me?" When Gabe's silence stretched on, Seth added, "One of us has to stay up here, keep a lookout, right?" But Gabe could not, in fact, speak. In the space behind Seth, where the dim silhouette of the tree trunks and branches should have been, there was only a wall of darkness rushing closer, solidifying into the shape of a tall, wide body. A pair of blue eyes wavered in the air like flame. Gabe stumbled backward as Seth glanced up to see what was the matter. The darkness seemed to swoop forward, and that's when Seth slipped. Or was pushed. With a brief and strangely quiet yelp, he disappeared through the broken net of roots and into the rift, but Gabe was the one who screamed. Over the echo of his own voice, he thought he heard a familiar laughter. With a crushing panic, Gabe realized that they'd both fallen for another one of the hunter's traps. "Seth!" Gabe cried out, then glanced around the clearing. It was now still, but the quiet was no comfort. A whimpering sound rose up from the hole. Gabe lay flat on his stomach and scrambled farther forward, peeking over the edge of the well. Several feet down, Seth clung to a stringy root. The thin strand was slowly pulling out from the dirt. Struggling to stay near the rim, Seth placed one hand in front of the other, gripping another root. His feet scrabbled against the dirt for the foothold, and stones and clumps of earth fell from the wall and rattled into the maw. "Seth," Gabe said as evenly as he could, "calm down and listen to me. We're going to get you out of there, but you need to relax, okay?" "Okay," Seth muttered, his teeth chattering. He shook his head and said it again, this time louder, as if to himself. "Okay. Now give me your hand." Gabe extended his arm. Seth let go of the first root, and the second loosened from the dirt. He slid further into the hole. "I can't," Seth said. Once he'd stopped swinging, maybe I should just go down. "No," said Gabe, speaking quickly. He's here. Going down there is what he wanted. He pushed you." "I fell," Seth insisted. "Something snuck up behind you," Gabe went on. It wasn't reassuring, but Seth needed to understand. "The stone in the barn wasn't a clue. It was a lure. We're right where he wants us. If we go down there, he'll bury us with him." "Why would he do that?" Seth said, panting. "So he has someone to keep playing the game with." An instant later, the words rang back at him, each time sounding more and more like the answers the boys had been trying to uncover all along. "There's no time to argue. We've got to get you out. Give me your hand." Seth yowled as he pulled himself back toward the mouth of the well. He kept his eyes on Gabe's as if Gabe could send him strength. Inch by inch he climbed, wincing and groaning, but making enough progress so that eventually their fingers made contact, then their palms. Finally, Gabe wrapped his hand around Seth's wrist. Starlight illuminated Seth's face as he peered into the space up beyond Gabe. Reflected in his friend's eyes, Gabe saw movement. "Watch out," Seth shouted. "Behind you." Too late. Gabe felt himself sliding forward. His chest scraped against the rough rocks. In his struggle to halt his descent, his jacket tore. His skin became slick with sweat or blood. He lost his grip and Seth fell, swallowed by the dark. A new howl battered his eardrums. Only after a few seconds did Gabe realize the sound was coming from his own mouth. Someone stood above him, but he couldn't see who or what it was. Something sharp pressed into his back, talons, claws, fingernails, and squeezed. Gabe tried to shout again, this time for help, but he couldn't catch his breath. He twisted, fighting to turn over, to face the thing that had decided that his life was a prize to be won. The thing had other plans. It pushed Gabe toward the mouth of the well. The hole seemed to expand. The roots brushed at his face. Swinging his arms out, Gabe reached for something to hold on to. There was only weightlessness, a rushing black, which was followed by the certainty that in a moment the game would be over. He'd lost. Beneath the crooked tree. Gabe opened his eyes. Walls of darkness surrounded him. He rolled over, sat up, and flinched. His head wrung with a dull pain. It felt as though every bone hurt. Tasting blood, he knew he'd bitten the tip of his tongue. Leaning forward, he stirred up a foul smell of rot from a thick layer of dead leaves. Water trickled nearby. Pieces of dirt and stone rained down from above, spattering his face as he looked up, trying to see how far he'd fallen. But above, he found only a ceiling of shadow. "Seth?" Gabe whispered. No answer. He listened for movement. His lungs clenched. His skin went numb. The ground seemed to tilt. He clutched at his scalp, trying to steady himself. They'd both fallen into the hole, into the altar. No, they'd been pushed. So where the heck was Seth? Gabe knelt, feeling for the wall. The space down there seemed larger than it should have been, but maybe the earth had crumbled away like a sinkhole. "Hey!" he cried out. "Anyone up there?" His voice bounced, its clarity like a shock. Gabe stumbled forward and finally made contact with the edge of the cavern, a wall of stone and dirt covered with spongy mosses and fleshy fungi. Or at least that's what Gabe hoped it was. A slithering sound came from several feet away. Gabe froze. "Seth?" "Shh," said a voice. "Who are you?" Gabe spoke louder this time, trying to shh. The voice repeated, "He'll hear you." The voice sounded familiar and very close. "Seth, is that you?" Gabe went on. Icy fingers covered his mouth. Gabe yelped, but pressed his lips shut. The other person pushed him to the wall, positioned Gabe's back against it, then pressed into the space beside him. The hand's clammy skin emitted a scented mixture of sweat and strangely dried fruit, which reminded Gabe of the inside of Seth's house. He reached up, trying to tug the hand away from his face, but the fingers only clenched more tightly around his jaw. Heavy feet squished into the mud and muck somewhere just ahead of them. Something was being dragged across the ground. The sound of brittle sticks clattered like toneless wind chimes. Bones. Then a growl tumbled through the darkness. Gabe held his breath, grateful for the stranger's warning. He listened as the footsteps retreated, echoing as if down a tunnel. Just how big was this hole in the ground? The hand let go, but Gabe did not move. When the sounds were finally gone, the dark rushed in from all sides. He stepped away from the wall, but felt blind, exposed on all sides, so he came back again, too stunned to speak. "You hit your head pretty hard," said the voice, male, maybe around Gabe's age. "It took a while to get through to you." "I'm sorry," said Gabe as politely as he could, "but I don't—" The boy's nervous chuckling interrupted him. "I'm the one who should be apologizing. I must have freaked the stuffing out of you." The boy paused, became serious. "But you're not safe here. He's looking for you, and he'll be back soon. We don't have a lot of time." "Who's looking for me?" "Mason," said the boy. "Well, the hunter. But I refuse to call him that anymore, even though it makes him mad. Really mad." Gabe trembled. He glanced around, beginning to discern small impressions in the dark. "Where am I?" "The dungeons of Castle Chicken Guts," he spoke to him. The dungeon of Castle Chicken Guts, he spoke so matter-of-factly that Gabe nodded as if the boy had said, "The parking lot of the Dunkin' Donuts out by the highway." "It was the best I could do under the circumstances. Of course, the towers of Haleth Keep would... Of course, the towers at Haleth Keep would have been a better bet, but Seth is too far gone. I couldn't reach his thoughts as easily as I reached yours." The words finally escaped him. I don't understand," said Gabe. "The kingdom of Chicken Guts exists in your head," the boy answered plainly, "so I guess you could say that's where we are right now." "In my head?" Gabe shook his skull. A dull ache blossomed behind his ears. He pressed his fingers against his temples and winced. "But this feels so real." "That's the strange thing," said the boy. "It is real. I don't have a clue how it works. I've never done this before. Not sure I'd even be able to do it if it weren't Halloween. Rumor has it that tonight we're at our strongest. Through the thinnest veil we can almost fully appear in the world of the living, but it goes both ways. Tonight you guys can see into our side, too." "Your side?" "The realm of the dead sounds so dramatic," the boy sniffed. "Right now we're standing somewhere in the middle, a kind of borderland in your unconscious." "If I'm dreaming," Gabe thought. "I'm at the bottom of a well. I have to wake up. I have to help Seth." He imagined that somewhere in the world of the awake, he and Seth were side by side, their bodies twisted, their bones broken. "Dreaming, awake, living, dead," the boy went on. "It doesn't matter what you call it right now, Gabe. Really, it makes no difference. Mason has had a long time to teach himself to navigate between these states. At this point, it is easy for him as opening a door. As you've seen, he knows some other pretty awesome tricks. I mean, he was strong enough tonight to snatch your little sister out of your home. And that's not the worst he can do, or will do. I, on the other hand, am still learning the ropes." Gabe struggled to focus through the darkness. "You're the boy I saw in the barn," he said. "You brought me that stone. You helped me get away from the fire?" "Yes, I did." "Why?" "Because I want this to be over as much as you do." "Can you show me what you look like?" Gabe asked, though he was fairly sure he already knew. "I'll try," said the boy. "Gotta be quick about it, though. Mason's out there, looking for a way in." Gabe wondered where out there was. Your dungeon will only keep him at bay for so long. A blue glow appeared in the space between them. The boy had extended his hand, and a flicker of what looked like an iridescent flame floated a few inches above his palm. Slowly, the boy brought the light closer to his face. Gabe gasped. He was staring at someone who looked remarkably like Seth. He was a little bit older, perhaps, but they had the same sharp jawline, the same light hair, the same pointed nose. The boy smiled. "I know he's mentioned me a few times." He reached out for Gabe's hand, but Gabe was too frightened, too shocked to move. "I'm David," said the boy, Seth's older brother. He clutched Gabe's wrists. The bluish flame joined them together, raced up their arms across their shoulders, shrouding their bodies in a blinding light until in a flash of pure white the room disappeared entirely. Mason's trap. Gabe was high above the forest that separated his grandmother's property from the Hoppers. Not floating or flying, he simply existed there, like a low cloud on a windless day. He had a view of the houses and the town, and if he squinted he could also see the water of the bay off in the distance. The sun was shining, the trees were green. This was another time, another season. The past or future, Gabe was not sure. The screen door at the Hopper's porch slammed shut. A boy raced down the front steps onto the driveway, then turned toward the woods. It was David. He looked furious and terrified. With barely any effort, Gabe swooped down, following David as he crossed into the woods, barreling like a wild animal up the old horse trail, unaware of Gabe's presence. After a few minutes, the boy stopped, hunched over, his hands resting on his knees, struggling to catch his breath. "You have to leave me alone," he shouted, as if to the trees. "Take me if you want, but don't touch him. If I'd known what you'd planned, I'd never have—" A rustling sound moved steadily through the woods. David spun, his chest heaving still. His eyes flicked back and forth, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. Someone out there was laughing, that familiar harsh chuckle, the same one that Gabe had heard in the darkness at the edge of his bed. Grunting, David catapulted himself into the brush, crashing through whips of foliage and lashes of tree limbs. Moments later, he came upon a small hillock. The trunk of a tree rose from the earth and twisted, leaning precariously toward the forest floor, as if it were about to topple over. There was no altar here now. The only stones nearby were the ones that made up the wall beyond the mound. David froze. A figure stood before him, holding on to the lowest branch of a pathetic tree. A tall, lanky boy with big hands and long fingers was dressed in dusty overalls speckled with the brown, dried blood from a long-dead rooster. The boy smiled. His eyes were vacant, amused, curious, like a child who's just plucked the leg off a grasshopper and was waiting to see what it would do. Gabe tried to speak, to warn David to stay away, but he had no voice. "Mason," David said, direct and calm. The panic he'd displayed minutes earlier was tamped down, hidden. "See, you can be yourself. You don't have to be the monster all the time." "But if I'm not the monster," said the boy by the tree, his voice plaintive and low, "you won't play the game with me, and I'll be alone again." "No, you won't. I'm not going anywhere." "Not true," said the boy. "I heard you tell your brother that you wanted him to stop playing. You think I want you both dead. I only said that because you've been a little intense. The hunter's a fun adversary, but only in the game. It's not so fun for me and Seth if the hunter is real." "I'm real," said the boy, his voice dropping further to a frightening register. "Yes, of course," David answered quickly, "and that's why I'm not going anywhere." The boy was quiet for a moment. Then he shook his head. "You'll grow up. You'll get old. You'll forget." "I won't forget. I promise." "People believe they'll be one way, but then they transform. They don't even mean to. I've seen it happen. To everyone. And when you're the one who's forgotten, who's left behind, it hurts." He paused, shook his head. "You have no idea how much it hurts." Gabe thought of his grandmother's story, her ruined friendship with him. Of course Mason would have felt abandoned, not only by Lisi, but by his parents, by his horrible aunt and uncle. Being discarded was pretty much all he'd ever known. What had he been willing to do to change that? "I'll leave your brother alone if you do one thing for me," he said. "What is it?" David asked. "Come here." When David stayed put, Mason waved him forward blithely. "I want to show you something." David shuddered, then made his way up the shallow slope, crunching dead leaves and fallen sticks until he stood behind a tree trunk. Gabe stayed close. He peered at Mason, whose pinkish face was flecked with dirt. A mole marked his cheek just below his left eye. His hair was greasy and unwashed. He blinked and scratched at his arm and bit at a loose piece of his skin on his lip. Except for the old blood that had dried onto his clothes, he looked like he could have been one of Gabe's own classmates. As human as anyone. This boy was no revenant, was he? "What did you want to show me?" David asked, his voice now shrunken. "I never told you about what happened to me," Mason said. "Aren't you curious about how I got this way?" "This way?" Did he mean dead? David paused. "You'll leave Seth alone if I say yes." It wasn't a question. Mason pursed his lips and raised an eyebrow. With a smirk, he nodded. "Okay, then," David answered. "Yes." They were standing several feet from the base of a tree. Mason simply pointed at the ground. David looked down, confused, but Gabe knew what he meant him to see. There was no dirt beneath David's boots, only a couple of wooden planks. David glanced back up at Mason, but Mason was no longer there. In his place stood the monster, the creature from Grandmother Lisa's drawing, a mass of muscle and bone, of pale, cracked, and bleeding hide. The thing smiled hideously. It lifted one immense foot and brought it down hard. The planks shattered. David fell. He twisted his body as he realized what was happening, reaching for the low tree trunk, but it wasn't fast enough. He screamed as he fell. In a blink, Mason, the hunter, disappeared too. Gabe could not watch. A sickening thump belched forth from the hole. Seconds later came a shriek that went on and on. He tried to cover his ears, to block out the sound, but he had no body, no ears to cover. Then he remembered he could follow David down into the earth. He hesitated before descending the shaft. This time he was aware of the nightmare he would encounter below. David lay on the wet ground. He struggled to stand, but he couldn't move his legs. Gabe could feel David's broken bones as if they were his own. His pain was immense, worse than anything he'd ever imagined. David breathed deeply, then glanced around. There was just enough light in the cramped space to see he'd landed on something, canvas or denim, that had nearly rotten through. He clutched at what was left of a metal rivet, the kind of clasp you find on a pair of jeans or overalls. And inside the clothing were long, stick-like objects. Running his fingers blindly over the jumble of decayed things, he understood what Mason had wanted to show him. Bones. David had landed atop the boy's skeleton. "Help!" he cried out through the agony in his chest. "Mom! Seth!" "Shh!" said a voice in the darkness. David froze. A sticky mix of tears and blood and mucus leaked down his face. His arm hurt too much to lift from his side and wipe it clean. "Why did you do this to me?" David asked. "I promised I wouldn't leave," chuckling. "Now I know it's a promise you'll keep." A scuttling sound rushed up the well, and David knew he was alone again. Someone would come, he promised himself. His thoughts began to race. A rescue team would find him. There'd be a television crew. There always was. Tomorrow at this time he'd be lying in bed with a story to tell. Everyone would know his name. People would pay him just to show up places. He'd write a book about how he survived. Maybe he'd get rich. This fall could end up being a very good thing, he told himself. "Hello down there." A face appeared at the mouth of the hole, barely distinguishable through the network of the tree roots. Still David knew it was Mason. His heart turned to stone, his blood to ice. His bones may as well have been glass. Mason sounded cold, purposeful, resigned. "I'm up here." "I know that," David whispered. "Good, because this is what I wanted to show you." Mason, dressed in his phantom overalls, stared down at him for a few seconds. David saw that he was holding an object out over the opening, but he couldn't tell what it was. "On the night that I was unlucky enough to find this pit," he said, sounding almost robotic, "I'd done something really bad, but I'd done it to hurt a nasty person, so I felt kind of good. I don't know if God punished me for taking pleasure in my sin, but I ended up where you are now. I too called out for help. I screamed. I shouted over the rain and thunder, hoping that someone would hear me. There was this girl who lived up the hill, a friend. At the time, I wished she'd been." He paused, sounding for a moment like he could actually feel something other than anger. "But she wasn't, and she didn't. Someone else heard me instead. My Aunt Verna came out here with a flashlight. She looked down at me just like I'm looking down at you. Then she snatched up a rock from one of the stone walls nearby, like the one I'm holding in my hands now, and she raised it over the mouth of this hole. And she stared at me for several seconds, full of spit and hate and spoiled blood, and I stared back, feeling the same thing. Then she let go of the rock, and it fell, just like it had fallen several minutes earlier. Just like I'd fallen several minutes earlier. Just like you've fallen today. My aunt's rock came at me quickly, just like this rock will do when I let go of it." The boy paused. In a moment. Then he smiled sadly, and with a wistful look, he tilted his head. "Are you ready?" David shouted, struggling to raise his arms over his head. "No, Mason, please don't." "But this is what I wanted to show you," the boy whispered, his voice somehow echoing in David's ears. "And you said yes." "I changed my mind. I don't want to see." "Don't worry. Now we'll have all the time in the world for our game. You'll be the good guy. I'll be bad." And with that, Mason let go. Instructions. Gabe closed his eyes. He couldn't watch. He waited for the horrific crunching sound to burst his eardrums, for a warmth to splash at his ankles. Neither came. He opened his eyes as David released his hand. The blue flame that hovered in the poor boy's palm diminished to the size of a small coin. They were back in the dungeon of Castle Chicken Guts, wherever that was. "I'm sorry," Gabe whispered. "I don't know what to say. You didn't deserve to die like that." He thought of Mason, too, of his aunt discovering him at the bottom of the well on that stormy night and killing him simply because he'd slaughtered her rooster. Well, that and the fact that she was probably insane. No one does. David nodded. "When I had gone away from my body, I watched Mason cover this hole with new boards." He spoke quickly now, rushed. Then he stacked stones on top, organized properly the old tree's roots supporting the weight. Mason needed to hide what was left of me from the search parties that scoured the woods over the next few days. If they located me, he knew they'd take me away from him, bury me properly, put me to rest. His ploy worked. When they came through, the people thought the stones were just a part of another ruined wall. Mason laughed at me when I tried to call out to them. I didn't know yet that you couldn't be heard. "Why didn't you take the stones away? Let the people find you." "At first, I didn't know how to do that either. When I refused to play Mason's games, he refused to teach me what he knew about being, dead. And by the time I figured out how to direct enough energy to move objects like these stones, Mason had gotten to Seth, manipulated him into rediscovering the old game, and Seth had talked you into joining him." "My grandmother's figurine," Gabe muttered, remembering. The black stone that you and Seth stole? It was you who returned it to the library, wasn't it?" "I never should have taken it in the first place," David sighed. "I brought it back there, thinking it might give you a clue about what had happened to me. I wish I could have done more to communicate, but I was still weak. The day you guys tried to dismantle the altar, it took all my strength to whisper at you to stop. I was scared that if you uncovered the old well, you'd end up where I did," he scoffed. I was right. Tonight, when I realized that Mason had taken your sister, I would have done anything to save her myself, but he stood guard in the barn, waiting for you. There is no way I could get by him, so I came up with a different plan." "The rock," Gabe said. "The one you dropped at my feet at the barn? The one I used to smash open the door?" "A clue," David nodded, "to lead you to the well." "But why if you wanted us to stay away?" "Because Mason's changed into something he can't control. He believes he is the hunter. Being down there alone for all those years, well, conditions were perfect for his anger to boil, become molten. I don't think he even meant to do it, but somehow he turned himself into that monster." "A revenant," Gabe whispered. "After you've been hurt over and over, maybe it's easy to become the villain." "Make people fear you," Gabe said, thinking of Seth, of lunch periods, of puppet boys, so you can control them. I thought that tonight might be my only chance to warn you. The old well needed to be found, our bones buried. It's the only way." A soft rumbling shook the ground. David closed his hand, extinguishing the flame. "He's here," he whispered. David clasped Gabe's shoulder and leaned closer. "Mason is going to ask you to join him. He knows that to keep you, he needs your consent. Otherwise, he's stuck again with someone who will not be his toy, like me. You must refuse no matter what he promises. You know what happens if you say yes to him, right?" Something knocked against the wall. Dirt rumbled to the floor from all around. "Do you understand?" Gabe felt himself trembling. "Yes, I understand." "But most important," David whispered, his voice barely audible, "you have to get out of the hole. I'm sorry I led you here, but you and Seth were the only ones who could see the truth. If you don't escape, Mason will find someone else to play with, someone else to haunt, to hunt. He's already visited a bunch of other kids here in Slade. He's got his eyes set on your friend Mazzy especially." David paused and took a deep breath and added, "Tell my brother and my mom that I love them, and that I'm sorry." The earth shattered. Clods of dirt exploded into the room, and Gabe screamed, fell back, and landed on his side. A wide gap had opened in the wall. Hazy light filtered through a cloud of dust, revealing a massive silhouette standing in the shadows. Two flecks of familiar blue flame glowed where the head appeared to be, staring into the room with fierce glee. David was a mere outline now, a foggy figure fallen beside the beast. "Run!" he cried. With a twist of his forearm, the hunter knocked him away. David was gone. Shoved out of Gabe's mind somehow. He was alone with the hunter now, in the dungeon he'd invented, in a peculiar darkness that only he knew. "Wake up," Gabe said to himself. He slapped his own cheek hard. It stung the same way it would if he'd been conscious and aware. Panicked, Gabe worried that if his body felt pain here, maybe it could die here too. The hunter stepped toward him. In the slight glow of his eyes, Gabe noticed its lips part, a grin. "I found you," a voice rumbled so deeply the sound was like a quake, like continents shifting. Gabe collapsed, every inch of himself aching. He struggled to lift his head and stare into the eyes of the massive thing that had once been a boy named Mason Arngrim. "Let's play." "No, no," Gabe said, forcing his sore jaw to move. "I want you to leave us alone." The creature's mouth spread wider. The hunter chuckled, then reached across its broad torso for the bow and arrow strapped at its shoulders. Placed the arrow's notch against the string, pulled the bow taut until it squeaked, then directed it at Gabe's forehead. "Wake up!" Gabe screamed. Bodies at rest. The shadows wavered. The room went all static-like. The world shifted, flickered, changed channels. Gabe lay on his side at the bottom of the well, his eyes open, conscious, away from the hunter, away from Mason, and the question that David had assured him was coming. Yes or no? He gasped, then choked and ended up coughing for several seconds. His body no longer throbbed in agony like it had in the dungeon. Now he could pinpoint the pain. His elbow, his shoulder. He touched his forehead. His fingers located a tender lump above his right eye. He imagined he looked like a corpse, but he was alive. He would heal. A tunnel of stone and dirt rose up in a cylinder shape. A hint of pale light passed through the thick web of roots near the opening at the top. Dawn had arrived. They must be sick with... He'd spent the night down there. Gabe thought of his family and how they must be sick with worry. But that was a good thing. It meant they were looking for him. Any moment now they'd peer down at him, call out his name, tell him they love him, and assure him that in no time he'd be safe and sound. And once he was in their arms, the scolding would begin. He would welcome it. He wouldn't wait for his mother and father to yell at him. He couldn't wait for his mother and father to yell at him. He sat up and felt around. The ground was damp. He imagined the skeletons layered beneath him, but the thought of dead bodies was only slightly terrifying. Right now he needed to be sure that there was another living boy in this pit, his friend, Seth Hopper. Gabe touched damp cloth only inches away. He clutched a pair of soaked jeans. Inside, Seth's leg felt warm. Rising awkwardly to his knees, Gabe leaned forward. In the faint light, Seth's face appeared to be scraped up, covered in mud and filth. His eyes were closed. Gabe placed a hand on his chest. A heartbeat. He yelped with relief. "Hey, Seth, wake up!" He rubbed at Seth's sternum, trying to rouse him. "Seth," he said again louder, "can you hear me?" Seth's lips parted, and he released a soft moan. "We're okay. We had an accident. We fell. Someone's coming to help." Seth's eyelids fluttered open. He looked directly at Gabe. "Gabe?" he mumbled. Then his eyes grew wide. "Where is he?" he whispered a bit more clearly. "Did we find the body?" Then Gabe remembered. Seth didn't yet know that his brother was dead. Should he tell him now, or wait until they were above ground? What if he was wrong? What if none of the vision had been real? "Yes," he answered. "He's here." It was just vague enough to be true. "Good," Seth said. "Then we won." Gabe felt his throat closing. If he looked at Seth any longer, he'd start crying. And this was no time to cry. He struggled to stand in the narrow space, trying not to step on anything fragile. "We haven't won anything till we're out of here," Gabe said, glancing upward. "I don't know if I can get up," said Seth. "Then just stay where you are." Gabe called out for help, his voice resounding for several seconds afterward. "Someone must have heard that," he said. He tried again and again. Seth lay at his feet and merely listened. After several minutes, Gabe grew tired. He slumped against the wall, and a sharp edge of a rock poked into his back, and he flinched. The light continued to grow from above. The stone walls were black and slick with slime and moss. Some parts were cracked and crumbling. The base of the wall was littered with fallen rocks and leaves, and a few other obscured things Gabe didn't care to think about. The space was tight, but not tight enough for Gabe to reach out and touch both sides. Scaling the wall would be difficult, but maybe not impossible. He'd been pretty good at rope climbing gym class last year. If he could find stones that stuck out of the wall, like the one he just leaned against, he might be able to reach the root system above. From there, he was almost certain he could drag himself to freedom. He felt for the sharp rock by his shoulder, then carefully he pushed on it, adding more and more weight, testing its bearing. The stone shifted, slipped out, and crashed to the floor, just missing Seth's hand. Seth flinched, turning his body away, but he barely moved before crying out in agony. "Sorry," Gabe said. "I thought I might—" Some of the other rocks slid out too, hitting the ground. Thud, thud, thud. "There goes that idea." "I hear something," said Seth. "It was me," said Gabe, indicating the rocky mess at his feet. "No, something else. Someone's coming." Gabe listened. Sure enough, footsteps crunching through the forest above. He nearly called out again, but Seth grabbed his ankle. When he looked down, Seth shook his head, and when the voice shouted out to them, Gabe felt numb. "Hello down there," Mason said with a chuckle. Get out of here," Seth stammered, staring up at the well's mouth. Gabe crouched low and shushed him. A wind rustled impossibly into the shaft, whipping leaves and dirt into a blinding frenzy, carrying with it laughter, delight, the frightening sound of decided ignorance. Then it stopped. Sticks and stones rained down on the two shuddering boys. "Get out of here!" The voice was now close by, at the bottom of the well. Strangely, it did not echo. "That's your answer?" Gabe searched every shadow for movement, but saw only the stillness of the black stone. "That's not something a winner would say, and that's what you are, right, Raven? A winner." Seth grunted, angry that he could not move, could not fight. "We won," he said. We won," said Mason, mimicking Seth. "Your words, cousin." His laughter died, and he added, "I disagree, though. We are only just beginning. Don't you think so, Meat Pie?" "No," Gabe said, remembering David's warning, wondering now if no was the only answer safe to give. "What I think I have here," said Mason, "are a couple of losers. Losers at school, losers with your little friends, losers at living. Get out of here?" He chuckled again. "If you want to win, you have to keep playing the game." "Say no, Seth," Gabe whispered. "Tell him no." "Aha," said Mason. "No cheating. Everyone gets to decide for themselves. Those are the rules." "There are no rules," said Gabe, "and you know it. Even if there were, you'd probably break them anyway." "Who told you that?" Mason asked, sounding amused. "Was it David?" Gabe held his breath. Seth glanced up at him, confused. "David told you about me breaking rules? Oh, I'm sure I interrupted some sort of private conversation back in your quaint little dungeon." "What's he talking about?" Seth whispered. "Oh, that's right," said Mason. "Raven's dead brother came to rescue Meat Pie, but didn't invite Raven to join." "David's dead?" Seth's voice was high-pitched and shaky. And while you were sleeping, dear boy, Mason's voice dripped with venom, your brother's ghost paid your friend a visit. They shared secrets, and why do you think that was? It's not like that, Gabe blurted out. Mason's twisting the truth. Doesn't he love his little brother? David's dead? Seth repeated. He managed to prop himself up against the stones at his back. I had some sort of vision, said Gabe, a dream. In it, I saw the past. David fell down here. Mason tricked him, made sure he never got back out. I was going to tell you about it, I swear. Seth dug his fingers into the dirt beneath him, as if searching for bones. I don't understand, he squeezed his eyes shut. Laughter swirled around them, growing louder like a lasso tightening. I don't either, said Gabe. In my dream, David told me that you were too far away. He said that Mason would come for us, that he'd ask you to join to play the game. He made me promise to say no. You too, Seth. If we don't, Mason will kill us. He'll be the hunter, and we'll be the robber princes, like, forever. When you put it like that, who would say yes? Mason chortled. No, David had it wrong. What I'm offering is much more than that. An opportunity to start over. Think about it. Mason sounded like an excited little boy, a Peter Pan unable to grow up. It only hurts a little. For that small price, you two can be royalty, heroes. When you're in Howler's Notch, you'll live in castles as big as you can imagine. You'll be free. No one will call you names. No one will threaten you or hit you, or lock you away, or burn everything you've ever loved. Well, no one besides me, of course. We'll be worthy foes, cats and mice, hunters and hunted. Just like before. Some days you'll win, other days I'll eat you for supper. His voice lowered. The hunter's growl momentarily enveloped them, tasted their skin with a rough tongue. But the important thing is, Mason went on, a boy again, we can be friends, true friends. Admit it. Haven't the past few months been the most exciting of your life? No, said Gabe, it hasn't been fun. It's been scary. You've hurt people, lots of people, in lots of different ways. After my grandmother told me your story, I felt bad for you. Horrible, in fact. He spoke to the air as if it was what Mason was made of. Because of what you'd been through. I didn't even mind so much that you chopped off that rooster's head, Gabe shuddered. But you can't do this to us, to anyone. His voice shook as it rose. You obviously haven't known what it's like to feel human for a very long time. But that still doesn't make you a monster, so stop acting like one. This isn't a game. We aren't your puppets. He slapped the rock wall, making an exclamation point. You have to let us go. We said no. The well was silent. No sounds. Not even the ones they'd heard earlier, the birds chirping, a trickle of water, the breeze through the faraway branches of the crooked tree. Gabe released a deep breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Mason was gone. Wait, said Seth, wide-eyed. Gabe stared down at his friend. When he tried to speak, nothing came out. He shook his head, begging Seth to stop talking, but Seth wasn't looking at him. With his eyes closed, he added, I want to see my brother again. His tears welled, then rolled down his cheeks. So yes, Mason, I'll come with you. The whole world seemed to sigh. Gabe felt the blood drain from his face. He reached for the wall. The stones were trembling. The earth began to shake. Gabe stared at Seth and shook his head. What did you do? He asked. I'm sorry, Seth whispered, then opened his eyes. A great cracking sound erupted several feet above. Gabe watched as one huge stone slowly crept out from the ancient bed rock, moving back and forth, farther and farther away from the wall. He imagined Mason's hands wrapped around it, pulling as hard as he could. David, Gabe called out helplessly, don't let him do this. But the stone continued to move, and the piece of the wall surrounding it began to follow. Several smaller rocks tumbled out, spilling onto Seth's face below. Gabe knelt beside him, struggling to pull him away from the spot where the wall was caving in. He grabbed at Seth's sweatshirt, but it slipped through his fingers. Seth seemed to be stuck in the mud and the leaves, or maybe something else was holding him in place. Something rising up from below, something with rotting skin and yellowed, split fingernails. Another crack rang out. Gabe glanced up. An avalanche of rock poured down. He leapt forward, covering Seth's body with his own. He felt warm, safe, protected. But Seth squirmed, tried to cry out, his voice muffled by Gabe's torn coat. Gabe didn't notice, and he didn't care. For one brief moment, before the darkness behind his eyelids turned entirely to white, he realized something that made him wish he could laugh. Mason had been right. It only hurt a little. Dead boys. In the days that followed, a chill settled upon Slade. Those who woke before sunrise were greeted with lawns glazed in silver. Frost had come late this year. The leaves had begun to fall in earnest. By the end of the week, there would be few trees left able to hold onto their colorful precarious gems, yet the ground itself still contained some of the warmth of the previous season. The men who worked at Evergreen Cemetery were pleased about this. It was easier to dig holes. Mazzie Lerman had never been to a funeral. Her grandfather had passed away when she was a baby, but that didn't really count. She remembered nothing of it. The Wednesday morning after Halloween, she stood with a large group at the side of a deep hole in Evergreen Cemetery. The air was brisk. The sky was perfectly clear. A priest was speaking, but Mazzie wasn't paying attention. She couldn't stop thinking that any moment she'd wake up, or the movie would end, or she'd reach the last page in a book she'd been reading and find the final words, the end. Then she'd put the book back on the shelf and call her friends and ask if they wanted to hang out. But this story just kept going and going all around her, and now they were putting a boy in the ground. Returning from the emergency room that night, Mazzie and her mother found their phone ringing as soon as they had stepped into the house. Judging by the look on her mother's face when she answered, Mazzie could tell immediately that something even worse had happened. "I haven't seen them," Mrs. Lerman said to this person on the other line. "We just got home." Mazzie reluctantly took the receiver. A voice on the other end introduced himself, a police officer. He asked if she'd seen Gabriel Ashe or Seth Hopper. "Not for a few hours. Not since we left the high school." He asked if she had any idea where they might be. Mazzie calmly answered, "The woods." She glanced at her mother, who glared back at her. She thought about everything the boys had shared with her, the game, their story, the hunter, as well as the conclusion they'd reached about the need to find Mason Arngrim's body. Then it struck her. "There's a crooked tree," she added. "I'm not sure where exactly. I think they may have been searching for some sort of pile of rocks around there." At Evergreen, she wiped wetness from her cheeks, then dried her palms on their black pants. Her mother tapped her shoulder, then shook her head. "Inappropriate," she mouthed. Mazzie sighed, crossed her arms. Most of the other congregants were crying too, holding tissues, dabbing at their eyes. Across the way, Felicia stood with her parents. Her face was bone dry, apparently made of stone. Malcolm and Ingrid were beside her. Felicia flicked her gaze toward Mazzie. The girls stared at each other expressionless, unwilling to concede, to display any emotion. To do so might hint at blame or guilt. The ashes were at the end of the casket, beside the priest. Gabe's parents stood frozen, staring into the hole in the ground, as if under a spell. His grandmother cradled Miri, who squirmed unaware of the meaning of this gathering. Mazzie wished she might catch their attention, but she knew to do so would be to risk losing her already paper-thin composure. Someone shifted to the side and revealed Seth Hopper standing several feet back. When he glimpsed Mazzie looking at him, he quickly ducked away again. So he'd finally gotten out of the hospital. Mrs. Hopper was beside him. She looked better than the last time Mazzie'd seen her. She stood up straight, and the dark circles around her eyes had diminished. People were saying that the Hoppers were holding a service for David tomorrow afternoon. Mason Arngrim wouldn't be buried until the following weekend, a cost the town council decided to absorb since he had no immediate family. Mazzie could only pray that the hauntings, or whatever they'd been, were over for now. She'd feel a lot better once they put Mason properly this time, whatever that meant. In memory of. The last few days of November were disappearing like magic. Sharon Hopper, as if having recently stumbled out of a thick fog, scoured the grime of her kitchen and bathroom and emptied the rest of her house of the clutter. Several times, as if in a half-hearted apology, she commented to her son that she could not believe she'd allowed it to get so bad. For Thanksgiving, she cooked an enormous turkey for the two of them, but Seth barely ate any of it. Later, he had a difficult time remembering the holiday at all. In fact, the weeks after Halloween was a blur. There had been doctors, appointments, crutches, casts, braces, physical therapy, and pain. Lots and lots of pain. School, for the time being, was out of the question. Though it was agonizing for Sharon to imagine what both of her sons had been through, or going through still, learning David's fate was like a salve that stung as it healed. By mid-December, Sharon was worried that she and Seth had switched places emotionally, at least. While she'd found another restaurant job, her son had taken to sleeping half the day. He barely responded when she asked him questions about how he was feeling and never offered comments on his own. She had no idea what would happen if she forced him to be around others while in this state, but according to Mr. Dover, Seth had already missed enough school that year, and unless she wished him to repeat the year, he needed to go back. When Seth limped into homeroom on the first day back, his classmates greeted him with applause. He didn't know what to do. All of these people who for the past few years had treated him like he was a monster were now cheering for him. He nearly turned around and ran down the hall, out of the front entrance, and all the way home. Sensing his unease, the teacher took his arm, walked him to his desk, and helped him to his seat. "Welcome back," she whispered in his ear. At that, Seth nearly threw up. He could never feel welcome here, when he wasn't the one who deserved to be back. Lunch period was the most difficult. Seth tried to keep it to himself, as he learned to do several years earlier, even though nearly all eyes followed him. Get up, throw away his brown bag, knocking over his juice box, sneeze. Everything seemed to matter to these people. He didn't know whether they watched him because they were planning to somehow ruin him again, or if they wanted to ask him what had really happened down in that hole in the woods. Neither choice was appealing. He'd been purposely vague when the detectives had questioned him, and they had so many questions. He lied and claimed he didn't remember a thing. When he closed his eyes at night, he heard the conversation between Gabe and David that must have occurred in the dreamlike dungeon version of the castle chicken guts that Mason had mentioned down in the well. Listening to David's plea, "Tell my brother and my mom that I love them," always woke him up, his chest tight with anxiety. He didn't know how to remember this, or why, or even if the dream had simply come from his own imagination. He'd like to think that maybe he hadn't been so far gone as David had said, that maybe he'd been right there with them. Since he'd switched lunch periods over a month earlier, Felicia and her group were now in constant view from across the room. Once she'd even waved him over. After that, he sat with his back to them. Mazzy was a different story. When she approached him in the hallways inviting him to get together to play catch, ride bikes, watch a video, Seth told her no, but secretly he was happy that she continued to ask. In the evening, Seth threw himself into his homework. Every now and again, hunched over his desk, he thought he saw someone watching him from outside of his bedroom window. Shaking off goosebumps, he'd reach for the curtains to block out the night and get back to work. Life continued on this way. By the end of the school year, the other kids seemed to have lost interest. He supposed that once they figured out he wasn't going to be sharing their secrets, he became less interesting again. Still, according to them, Seth Hopper was the hero of Slade, a moniker that provided protection against any other name-calling. The next summer, Seth found a job at a roadside vegetable stand. He rode his bike there every day. One afternoon, Mrs. Ashe, Gabe's grandmother, approached the counter searching for fresh strawberries. Seth hid, emerging only after his co-worker, a college student on break, completed the transaction. He'd managed to avoid the Ashes for months. They'd visited in the aftermath of the accident, but hadn't been there in a long time. Seth had nothing against them. How could he? Mrs. Ashe had insisted on paying for all of his medical bills, but his secret guilt was like a heavy stone in his tongue. That September, Seth moved up to high school with the rest of ninth grade class. Whenever he passed Felicia Nielsen, she looked like she'd forgotten what had happened here the previous year. He couldn't help but wonder if walking these new halls was as difficult for her as it was for him. He'd heard that she'd joined the school newspaper, the Latin Club, the Young Republicans group, and the Homecoming Committee. Sounded like she was trying to keep herself busy. Leaves once again fell from the trees, and the events of the previous year replayed in his mind. With October's end swiftly approaching, Seth found himself waking in the night, his heart pounding. Bad memories lived in nearly every acre of the town. Bus rides to and from school, the blackened ground where the old barn had once stood, the stone walls that wound through the woods. Slade had never before looked so threatening, but it was the date that he feared most. Seth had no idea how he'd get through this next Halloween, so when Mazzy asked him to spend it with her at her house, handing out candy to trick-or-treaters, he surprised himself by saying yes. He asked his mother for a ride. Later, as he waited for Mazzy to answer the door, he felt dizzy. That feeling of guilt crept up on him again, but then the doorknob turned and she greeted him with a warm smile. If only she knew the truth. A steady stream of ghosts and ghouls, wizards and princesses knocked on the Lerman's front door. Over the next hour, he commented easily enough on the cuteness of one costume to the next. When the foot traffic slowed down, Mazzy gestured for him to follow her into the living room. "I have a surprise," she said, plopping down on the couch. She picked up her remote and turned on the television. "I recorded this after school, but I didn't get a chance to watch yet. I hope you haven't seen it either." "What is it?" Seth asked, sinking into a soft, deep chair. On the screen, a strange animated clip began to play. Colors swirled, odd creatures grinned and danced, accompanied by music that was once cheerful and sad. It seemed to be the opening to one of those weird funny shows from the cable channel for kids. The title flashed as the music crested, "Monster Talk." Seth had never heard of it. Then, like a sharp poke in the ribs, a coda appeared, created by Gabriel Ashe. Seth released a small gasp. They watched the show that Gabe's dad had been working on the year before. Milton the Monster was the star, a fuzzy version of a late-night television host, and his first guest just happened to be the famous illustrator Elise Ashe. She bantered with the puppet, laughing at his jokes, answering questions. She revealed that her latest project was designing a new production of The Magic Flute, which was opening December at the Brooklyn Academy of Music in New York City. When the program had ended, Mazzy asked, "What did you think?" "I liked it," Seth said softly. "I thought it was good." "We should try to get tickets for The Magic Flute," Mazzy suggested with enthusiasm. "Take a trip to New York." When Seth simply nodded, she added, "It was weird seeing Gabe's grandmother up there, wasn't it?" "A little, but she looked happy." Mazzy was quiet for a moment. "I hope she is." She said seriously. Out on the street, some kids ran by, playfully shouting, "Happy Halloween!" "If she can be," Mazzy continued, "after everything that's happened, then maybe we can be too." If she can be, after everything that's happened, then we can be too. A few days later, Seth came home from the bus stop to find his house empty, his mother still at work. He made himself a snack of crackers and peanut butter and decided right then to pay Mrs. Ashe a visit. For the first time in a year, Seth wandered up the horse trail and into the woods between the houses. His heart raced as memories of Howler's Notch appeared all around him, but he pushed them away, concentrating on the path so that he wouldn't trip over a rock or a tree root. He emerged at the bottom of the grassy meadow that led up to the mansion. Hiking up it, he cringed, remembering the nightmare journeys he'd taken with his brother. He went around the side of the building to the front door, pulled a solid brass knocker, then let it go. It hit against the worn wood with a resounding crack. A few seconds later, he heard footsteps approaching. The door swung open. Seth, said Elise, surprised. Seconds ticked. He was about to turn and run when she added, "Come in. I just put on a kettle of water. Would you like some tea?" With his shoulders hunched, he stepped across the threshold. "The house is quiet now that Glenn and Dolores moved to Boston to be closer to the studio," she said, leading him down the hallway toward the living room. "Did you see the show?" Seth nodded. She directed him to sit. A few minutes later, she returned with a small tray and 2 steaming mugs. Before she could even place them on the office table, Seth blurted out, "Gabe saved my life." Elise froze and Seth blushed. "I'm sorry," he added. Mrs. Ashe smiled. "What are you sorry for?" She handed him a mug and sat beside him. "If it weren't for me, he'd still be here." "Don't say that. There's nothing further from the truth. You don't understand." "I understand perfectly well," she glared at him. "Don't do that to yourself. Trust me. It's not a good path to go down." "I don't care if it's good or not," Seth answered. "I just needed you to know the truth." "Okay then," she said. "I suppose if it weren't for me, Gabe would still be here too. I'm the one who moved into this house. I'm the one who invited his parents to come when they needed a place to stay. Or better yet, if it weren't for Gabe's dad, Gabe would still be here. He was the one whose workshop caught on fire. Better yet, if he'd never built puppets, none of this would ever happened. But wait, if it weren't for Jim Henson, Gabe would still be here. Mr. Henson gave my son the brilliant idea to become an artist. I guess we should blame him too?" Seth didn't know what to say. It seemed like she didn't want to hear the truth. It had been a mistake coming here. He sipped a hot drink and stared at the floor. "If Gabriel saved your life, then he thought you were worth it. And you know what you can do for him in return?" She didn't wait for an answer. "You can be thankful." Seth sat silently, considering her advice. "Wait here," she said, and stood. "I have something for you." She disappeared through the doorway and down the hall. Half a minute later, she returned, clutching a small object in her hand. She placed it on the table in front of him. It was a figure carved out of black stone, the one that David had stolen from her that night. The one Gabe had noticed sitting on David's bedroom. "I want you to take this." "But why?" "You know why," she said. Elise stared into his eyes. Seth felt his heart stop. "Take it and go." She paused and added, "But come back soon. It gets lonely on this hill. Bring your mother. I'll make cookies. What do you say?" It was too dark now to go back through the woods, so Seth made his way down Temple House's long driveway. On the street, whenever a car's headlights approached, he stepped onto the curb, patting the lump in his coat pocket. He thought about what Mrs. Ashe had said. Be thankful. He hadn't realized until now what he really was, in spite of everything he was. He didn't realize that he really was, in spite of everything he was. When he turned onto his own driveway, he saw the porch light on, spilling its orange glow out into the yard. His mom was home. He climbed the front steps and opened the door. The smell of spaghetti sauce drifted toward him. "Hello," he called out. "Dinner's almost ready," his mom answered from the kitchen. "Go wash up." He strolled down the hall towards his bedroom, but when he got to David's old bedroom door, he stopped. Reaching into his pocket, he stepped inside. Light from the hall spilled across the floor. He pulled out the figurine. He felt the weight of it, then placed it on top of David's old bureau. He stared at it for a moment, imagining its incredible journey. "Mrs. Ashe gave this back to me," he said quietly, thinking of his brother. "I thought you might want to have it." He almost had expected a response, to see the figurine topple over or to feel a cold touch on the back of his neck, but nothing happened. He stood alone in his brother's bedroom for a moment more, then turned toward the hall and closed the door quietly behind him. In his own room, he took off his coat, hung it on the back of his desk chair. He was so distracted by the aroma coming from the kitchen that when he passed by David's door, he didn't notice it had opened again, nor did he hear the hush of a whisper from the shadows just inside. The end. Hope you enjoyed it. Love you guys.